Yeah, okay. Hello, everybody. You're all very welcome to this special webinar lunchtime event. My name is James Curry, and I'm one of the Dublin City Council historians and residents. I'm based in the northwest area of the city, and I'm delighted today to be hosting the event in which one of my colleagues, Dr. Cormac Moore, who's the historian in residence for North Central area of Dublin, is going to be talking about the truce, which happened 100 years ago. So it's perfect timing for Cormac's talk. He's going to be looking at the background to the signing of the truce at the Mansion House 100 years ago, looking at the negotiations in 1920 and throughout the first half of 1921, which culminated in an agreement between Sinn Féin and the British government to bring an end to hostilities during the Irish War of Independence. And Cormac is the author of numerous books, including Birth of the Border, The Impact of Partition in Ireland, which is published by Merrion Press and very timely considering the current climate. And also he's written The Irish Soccer Split and the GAA versus Douglas Hyde. So today is a webinar event, and Cormac will be giving his talk. And then afterwards, I'll read out any questions or comments that you've typed into the chat box to him, and hopefully we can wrap up everything during the hour. So thanks very much for your attendance here. I'm going to hand you over to Cormac now for his talk about the negotiations which culminated in the truce 100 years ago. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James. I'm going to share my screen now, so hopefully everyone can see that. If there is a problem, just send a message in the chat box. So as James mentioned, today I'm going to talk about the build up to and the negotiations leading up to the truce. Today I'll be looking at the Truce of July 1921, which brought an armistice to the hostilities between the IRA and British forces that had been ongoing since January 1919, paving the way for negotiations between Sinn Féin and the British government to begin. The Truce of July 1921 was not the first attempt at a halt to hostilities. A number of attempts had been made previously, going back to the summer of 1920. Attempts by the British to talk to Sinn Féin in 1920 was fostered by a change in personnel of people running the Dublin Castle administration. Due to the dysfunctional nature of how Dublin Castle was functioning, Warren Fisher, the new permanent secretary to the Treasury and head of the civil service in Britain, was asked to take charge of an investigation of the workings of Dublin Castle in May 1920. In Fisher's caustic report to the British government, whilst his advice of a more conciliatory policy went largely ignored, at least in the short to medium term, his recommendations to change the personnel in Dublin Castle were heeded. He suggested that Sir John Anderson should be sent to Dublin as a joint under-secretary. He also recommended for Alfred Cope to be appointed as an assistant under-secretary. Other recommendations, such as Mark Sturgis, were also appointed. Most of Fisher's suggestions were hired and ran Dublin Castle until December 1922. Fisher's men were essentially supportive of these measures, undermining the Lord Lieutenant John French's already weakened authority, and created a climate in which the seeds of conciliation were more likely to germinate. And here are some of the new Dublin Castle officials, with Geoffrey Wiscard, Cope, Anderson and Sturgis seated. Fisher's suggestions on policy changes were too radical for the British government, a government dominated by the Conservative Party. The differences between the Hawks and the Doves amongst the British came to a head in a conference on Ireland in July 1920. Neville Macready, the new Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in Ireland, Anderson, Cope and William Wiley, the law advisor to the Irish government, presented a united front that no amount of coercion could settle the Irish question. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George's secretary, Tom Jones, seen here with Lloyd George, his suggestion of a middle way between coercion and talking to Sinn Féin, with a view to Dominion Home Rule as a final settlement, was also rejected. Lord Birkenhead complained that the advice offered by the new men amounted to an abandonment of the Government of Ireland Bill. Winston Churchill opposed concessions which could be claimed as a victory by the Sinn Féiners, as did Arthur Balfour, who favoured fighting the prevailing disorder. Lord Curzon, the Foreign Secretary, said the programme of mingled coercion plus the Government of Ireland Bill meant there would be no real attempt to settle the Irish question for 6 months. A part of the problem was that the new men in Dublin Castle were unaware of how important the Government of Ireland Bill was as a mechanism to resolve the problem of Ulster and not the problem of Ireland. In July 1920, the Hawks prevailed, and instead of the conciliatory measures being introduced, more repressive methods were approved, which included no communication being allowed between the British government and Sinn Féin. This didn't stop Cope, though, who continued his talks with Sinn Féin. Cope was on a mission ever since he arrived in Dublin in the spring of 1920. Mark Sturgis's diary provides a vivid record of a series of peacemaking moves beginning in July 1920 and recurring at regular intervals after that. Neville Macready frequently jibed at Cope for speaking to Sinn Féin, saying, "Well, has Andy gone down the drain again?" Lloyd George had asked Sir Charles Russell, an English barrister and baronet, to contact Sinn Féin to begin negotiations in July 1920. The British Prime Minister indicated that a negotiated peace was possible on condition that it excluded Michael Collins and other members of the IRA leadership. 2 months later, a meeting was arranged in Dublin between Arthur Griffith and Sir John Anderson, the Joint Under-Secretary for Ireland. The meeting was aborted at the last moment, though, apparently because Griffith insisted that the British would first have to recognise Dáil Éireann. Another peace initiative was put forward by General George Cockrell, a Conservative MP, who proposed in October 1920 that an immediate ceasefire between the IRA and the British forces should be arranged. Cockrell suggested that once this ceasefire began, Dáil Éireann would meet in public, with British approval and political negotiations could begin. Responding to this call, Patrick Moylett, an Irish Republican Brotherhood (IRB) member and judge in the Sinn Féin courts, met Cockrell and a number of other influential British politicians. Moylett was acting on his own initiative, though. He forwarded the British government proposals to Arthur Griffith that an immediate IRA ceasefire would lead to an informal truce between them and the British, followed by formal negotiations. Griffith broke down with emotion when a formal conference was proposed between the British government and the Dáil, the first time the British used the word Dáil. Michael Collins was also delighted. Whilst these talks were ongoing, behind the scenes, the official position of the British government was that it was fighting against a murder gang. The IRA campaign was an illegal attempt to overthrow legitimate British rule through terrorism, with many claiming Sinn Féin was part of a worldwide conspiracy led by Bolshevik Russia. Such rhetoric prevented members of the British government publicly calling for any contact to be made with Sinn Féin. When Lloyd George claimed they had murder by the throat at the Guildhall in London in early November 1920, a frustrated Michael Collins said, "I wonder what these people with their hypocritical good intentions and good wishes say to Lloyd George's speech yesterday. So much for the peace feelers." The fact that Griffith was willing to negotiate gave the British the impression Sinn Féin were ready to sue for peace at any cost, and that may have influenced the triumphalist nature of Lloyd George's speech. That, and the changed military outlook, was proof to the British that their measures to crush the insurrection and restore order was bearing fruit. This viewpoint was shattered by events in late November, the morning killings on Bloody Sunday, and the wiping out of an entire auxiliaries unit at Kilmichael in Cork. Those incidents led to a new impetus in British interest in negotiating a settlement. This new impetus was not helped by the arrests of Griffith and Owen MacNeill, another Sinn Féin TD. The British also informed Moylett that leading members of the IRA would not be immune from prosecution during a ceasefire. People like Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy could face subsequent prosecution. This brought Moylett's peace efforts to an end. Soon afterwards, another figure in Sinn Féin, Roger Sweetman, a TD representing North Wexford, the first TD to do so, called for an end to hostilities as a precursor to peace negotiations. He was also acting on his own initiative, was not taken seriously, and his intervention was seen as damaging and counterproductive. Disillusioned with the IRA's ongoing military campaign, he resigned in protest as a TD in January 1921. On the 3rd of December 1920, a Galway peace resolution was tabled at a special meeting of Galway County Council. As there was no quorum, with most councillors not in attendance, the meeting had no power to conduct official council business. At the meeting, councillor and IRA officer James Haverty claimed a truce was sought by both sides. It resulted in swift condemnation from other Republicans. The IRA in Galway despairingly referred to it as the White Feather Resolution and was anxious to take action to dispel the rumour that Galway had been tamed. When a copy of the resolution was circulated to Clare County Council, Michael Brennan, the council's chairman and leader of the IRA's East Clare Brigade, burned it in protest. The next peace initiative came from Father Michael O'Flanagan, who was appointed acting president of Sinn Féin since Griffith's arrest. He sent a telegram to Lloyd George saying, "You state you are willing to make peace at once without waiting till Christmas. Ireland is also willing to make peace. What first step do you propose?" O'Flanagan was also acting on his own initiative, but had a far higher standing in Sinn Féin than Moylett, Sweetman or Haverty. He also was willing to compromise on the full Republican attitude held by other members of Sinn Féin, and was one of the few Republicans to countenance partition. Initially, the British thought O'Flanagan spoke with the authority of the Dáil, but once they realised he did not, Lloyd George told John Anderson he must deal with someone who could deliver the goods. Subsequently, Anderson asked O'Flanagan to help him make direct contact with Eamon de Valera. Collins was extremely angry with O'Flanagan, stating publicly, "We must not allow ourselves to be rushed by these foolish productions or foolish people who are tumbling over themselves to talk about a truce, when there is no truce." He also said, only for Father O'Flanagan and Galway County Council, we would have a good settlement, but not a republic. The most realistic prospect in late 1920 came from Patrick Clune, the Archbishop of Perth. He met with Lloyd George on 1st of December, who asked him to meet with members of the Sinn Féin leadership to arrange an IRA ceasefire as a precursor to political negotiations. Collins was still in favour of a truce, stating, "It is too much to expect that Irish physical force could combat successfully English physical force for any length of time, if the directors of the latter could get a free hand for ruthlessness." Clune met Collins and through Alfred Cope met Griffith MacNeill and Michael Staines in Mountjoy Jail. Staines, a TD and Dáil Court judge, as well as an IRA officer and 1916 veteran, was one of the most militant of the Republican leaders. He believed the fighting men would be quite happy for a truce, provided there was no surrender of arms. Collins and Griffith were open to a truce if the terms were favourable. They wanted a bilateral truce and that all members of the Dáil could meet in the open. When Clune met Lloyd George again on 8th of December, the latter by that stage believed the IRA was desperate for a settlement. He imposed new demands, including that IRA leaders such as Collins and Mulcahy could not attend public meetings of the Dáil, and the IRA must surrender its arms. Clune rejected the terms, knowing they would not be accepted. Lloyd George stated there had been a shift in public opinion and that the British government's policies were winning the support of the decent public in Ireland, citing the Catholic Bishop of Cork, Daniel Colohan's condemnation of IRA ambushes in support of this. Rejecting Lloyd George's proposals, Collins stated, "We have clearly demonstrated our willingness to have peace on honourable terms." Lloyd George insisted on capitulation. Between them there is no mean, and it's only a waste of time continuing. "It may make it appear that we are more anxious than they. Let Lloyd George make no mistake, the IRA is not broken." On Christmas Eve 1920, on being provided with yet another rosy outlook by the British military and a commitment that the Government of Ireland Act, passed the previous day, should be allowed to come into operation first in the summer of 1921, the British Cabinet stuck with its demand that the IRA must surrender its arms. The Chief Secretary for Ireland, Hammer Greenwood, assured Lloyd George, and Sinn Féin cause and organisation is breaking up. Clune and everyone else admits this. There is no need of hurry in settlement. We can in due course and on our own good terms settle this Irish question for good. While some in the Cabinet favoured a compromise, most supported the continuation of the war and rejected the Republican proposals for a truce. A truce was not seriously considered by the British cabinet again until the late spring, early summer of 1921. In mid-March 1921, De Valera commented that feelers are being thrown out in all directions just now. A senior cabinet minister, Lord Derby, went over to Dublin to meet De Valera and the Catholic Primate of All Ireland, Cardinal Michael Logue, in April, but there still seemed little room for manoeuvre. The departure of Lord French as Lord Lieutenant in April, replaced by the first Catholic in the role since the 17th century, Lord Fitzalan, was another indication of a shift in the political atmosphere. Though far less influential than French had been, it was a symbolic gesture as a move away from coercion. That same month, Frank Percy Crozier, who had resigned as head of the auxiliaries in controversial circumstances in February, called for a truce. The British military's constant optimistic assessment of the situation on the ground in Ireland was beginning to ring hollow with members of the British cabinet, as its deadlines for victory were persistently broken. Even the perennially optimistic Hammer Greenwood, who earlier in 1921 proclaimed that Sinn Féin was losing popularity with the Irish public, admitted on 27th of April that Sinn Féin would sweep the board at the elections, and stated the British forces had failed in breaking the terror. He recommended a ceasefire with the IRA before negotiating with Sinn Féin, on the preconditions that Dáil Éireann would have to drop its demand for an Irish Republic, and that the constitutional position of the north of Ireland would not be affected. Likewise, Lloyd George's Cabinet Secretary Tom Jones doubted the British military's rosy outlook on the situation in Ireland, saying, "In the south the Sinn Féiners will be returned without contest. They will refuse to take the oath, and the government will have to decide whether to try to some sort of truce or constituent assembly or crown colony. Meanwhile, no general will name a date when murder will cease, and the Chief Secretary has dropped his optimism of 6 months ago and now talks of pacification in years rather than months." Due to the Government of Ireland Act coming into operation, the British government had to decide on what to do with Southern Ireland. The implementation of the Government of Ireland Act required that the Southern Parliament had to be established by 14th of July, with Sinn Féin almost sweeping the board in the Southern Ireland election, winning 124 out of 128 seats unopposed, and using it as a means to elect a second Dáil. The Southern Ireland Parliament under the Government of Ireland Act was clearly unworkable. If the Act could not be implemented by mid-July, Crown Colony government would be declared and martial law enforced throughout the 26 counties of Southern Ireland. It was a case, according to Macready, of go all out or get out. In preparation for a Crown Colony government, an additional 17 infantry battalions were deployed to Ireland from 14th of June to 7th of July, bringing a total of 80,000 British Army and 15,000 police forces in Ireland. Macready drew up plans of what a Crown Colony government with martial law enforced in the entire 26 counties would entail. Any damage to British government property would be recovered through a levy on the surrounding district. All cars, motorcycles, and privately owned motor transport were to be seized. All ports would be closed, and compulsory identification cards were to be introduced. Membership of Dáil Éireann, the IRA, and IRB was to be considered treasonous, punishable by death, and those caught with arms or ammunition would be tried by military court-martial and hanged. Anyone caught using arms against British forces would be summarily executed without trial. It was estimated that another 20 battalions of British troops would be needed, and up to 100 Republicans would be executed each week. Even such measures would probably not work. The British had responded to the increased IRA threat by introducing black and tans and auxiliaries, enforcing martial law in the southwest, executing Republicans and committing official reprisals. All had failed to halt the IRA campaign. In fact, in many ways, the IRA was more dangerous than ever. In May and June 1921, British Crown forces suffered record losses. From the beginning of the year to July, 94 soldiers and 223 policemen were killed, nearly double the totals, 47 and 127, for the last 6 months of 1920. In the last 12 weeks of the conflict alone, the toll of military and police deaths, 48 and 114, amounted to a quarter of all their fatalities since January 1919. There also was no guarantee that the British would be able to deploy extra military manpower resources to Ireland due to its international commitments and increased demand to quell insurgencies in Europe. The size of the British military had dwarfed from almost 4 million men to just under 400,000 in November 1920, reducing further to 218,000 in 1922. And in this time period, the British Empire had increased in size following the First World War. Troops were needed in India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Palestine. Social unrest in Britain, including miners' strikes, required troops. The threat of the IRA and troubles in Britain resulted in the transfer of 8 battalions from Upper Silesia, Malta, and Egypt in April 1921. There also was a danger of a prolonged insurrection in Ireland, spreading like contagion to other hotspots in the empire, such as India and Egypt. Coupled with this was a significant decrease in morale of British forces. In 1920 and 1921, 5% of the RIC, including black and tans and auxiliaries, were killed and 8% were wounded by IRA attacks. Suicide rates jumped in the RIC from 36.36 per 100,000 in 1920 to 88.88 per 100,000 in 1921. There also were abnormally high levels of suicide and desertion within the British Army, where many saw regular warfare far less trying mentally than the guerrilla campaign in Ireland. On top of the military complications of an all-out war of extermination in Ireland was the equally, if not more important factor of public opposition to the military campaign in Britain and internationally. Sinn Féin was far more adept at propaganda than the British were, something the British cabinet conceded. Winston Churchill, who previously had been one of the most hawkish on policy in Ireland, wavered in April 1921 and spoke of the great public importance of getting a respite in Ireland. He worried that we are getting an odious reputation and poisoning our relations with the United States. Through its propaganda news sheet, the Irish Bulletin, produced 5 times a week, the official press bureau and consulates it established in several European cities, as well as in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, South Africa, Chile, and Argentina, Sinn Féin ensured British reprisals were widely reported around the world. Unlike in the First World War, the British public knew what was happening in Ireland through journalists like Hugh Martin and Wilfred Ewart, and the increased importance of photojournalism in the press. The opposition in the House of Commons were increasingly using the negative press reports to good effect. Lloyd George described the situation in Ireland as a feud that was costly and embarrassing for us, a feud that brought no credit, no honour, and no strength. The British realised by the summer of 1921 that a truce was the only viable option left. Despite the increase in IRA activity in May and June, Sinn Féin desired a truce in the summer of 1921 too. The captured IRA report of May highlighted the IRA's inherent weakness. It was down to 2,000 active fighters in the field, who possessed between them no more than 569 rifles and 477 revolvers, with a mere 20 rifle rounds per weapon. Particularly through its chronic shortage of ammunition, its military capacity was diminishing. It did find ways of adapting to the new conditions, though, by increasingly using explosives. When the South African leader, Jan Smuts, and De Valera spoke in mid-June, De Valera said he was willing to negotiate with the British, but stressed the importance of a military truce between the IRA and British forces before any negotiations could begin. Smuts subsequently wrote to Lloyd George, saying the time was now opportune to declare a ceasefire as Northern Ireland was established and partition was copper-fastened. He recommended that the King's speech in officially opening the Northern Ireland Parliament on 22nd of June should be used to extend an olive branch to the Republicans. King George V gave a conciliatory speech in Belfast, calling for peace, asking opposing parties to forgive and forget. He followed up with the British cabinet, asking them to capitalise on the favourable atmosphere generated by his speech to begin negotiations with Sinn Féin. Even though De Valera was arrested in Blackrock on the same day as the King's speech, Lloyd George ordered his immediate release. Lloyd George then wrote to De Valera and the Northern Ireland Prime Minister, James Craig, 2 days later on 24th of June, inviting them to come to London to explore to the utmost the possibility of a settlement. Although Craig had shown openness to a more conciliatory approach by the British by agreeing to meet with De Valera in Dublin in May, he refused to attend the proposed London conference, and De Valera said he wanted to meet with unionist leaders in Dublin before agreeing to a formal acceptance. He invited Craig, Lord Middleton, Sir Robert Woods, Sir Maurice Dockrell, and Andrew Jameson to a conference in Dublin. As a sign of good faith, the British authorities released Arthur Griffith O'Macneil Michael Staines, Eamon Duggan and Robert Barton from prison to enable them to take part in the negotiations. Duggan and Barton, as well as being TDs, were senior figures in the IRA. Whilst Craig refused to come to Dublin to meet with De Valera, Middleton, Woods, Dockrell and Jemison met him and Griffith in the Mansion House on 4th of July. And here is De Valera and the Dublin Lord Mayor, Lawrence O'Neill, waiting for the Unionists at the Mansion House. Here are Middleton, Dockrell and Woods arriving, with an enthusiastic crowd looking on. The Southern Unionists agreed with De Valera that a truce should happen first before negotiations began. Lord Middleton was sent to London to confer with Lloyd George. Smuts, who coincidentally was in London at an imperial conference at the time, also arrived in Dublin at the same time and consulted with the Sinn Féin leadership. He met with De Valera, Griffith, Duggan and Barton, who told him they were going to refuse the offer to negotiate as Ulster would not be involved. Smuts advised that not accepting the olive branch would be a mistake and could turn public opinion, the main trump card, against him. When Smuts reported to the British Cabinet on 6th of July, Balfour and Henry Tudor, head of policing in Ireland, were the primary figures against the truce. Churchill acknowledged the failure of the policy of force. Macready favoured an open and formal truce, whereas Tudor preferred a tacit agreement. When Middleton returned to Dublin, he met with De Valera, Griffith, Barton and Duggan and the other Southern Unionists and stated that Lloyd George was reluctant to agree to a formal truce, but would do so if it was approved by the British military authorities in Ireland. The Unionists then consulted with Macready on 8th of July, 100 years ago today. General Macready agreed to draft truce terms and submitted these to the Mansion House Conference when it reconvened at 4 p.m. that afternoon. Macready then contacted Alfred Cope, Major General Gerard Boyd, commanding officer of the military in Dublin, and Tudor, and all of them agreed to the truce at 5:30 p.m. Middleton again contacted Macready, asking if he would agree to minor changes to the terms suggested by De Valera. In response to this message, Macready departed for the Mansion House and there announced his approval of the truce at the peace conference. When he arrived at the Mansion House, he was cheered by the crowd as he was met by the Lord Mayor, Lawrence O'Neill. In this image, you can see the imprint of the revolver in his coat pocket, which is clearly visible. Terms of the truce were reached at 8 p.m. on Friday, 8th of July, and Macready returned to the Royal Hospital in Kilmainham to telephone the result to Lloyd George in Downing Street. And here is De Valera trying to get to his car after leaving the Mansion House. And here are members of the crowd outside the Mansion House reciting the Angelus, praying for peace. From the press reports, it is not clear if everything was finalised on the evening of Friday, 8th of July, and that discussions continued on into Saturday, 9th of July. According to this report from the Irish Times on 9th of July, it states the Dáil, through the Irish Bulletin, declared it is expected that an announcement of a truce to take effect from Monday next will be made early tomorrow. Once an agreement was reached, it was decided that a truce would come into force at noon on Monday, 11th of July. This provided enough time for all units on both the British and Irish sides to be contacted to stand down from military activities. There appears to have been no document signed on the truce terms at the Mansion House, and this led to different interpretations on what was agreed. Macready believed 5 terms were agreed, whilst the IRA believed 4 terms were agreed. The failure to produce a single version resulted in some disputes subsequently. Michael Collins maintained in mid-July that the British were trying to regard a position not as a truce, but as a surrender on the IRA's part. The British tried to downplay the significance of the truce retrospectively. Instead of using the words truce or armistice, they preferred to use the use of the terms such as the agreement or suspension of activities. However, British references to the IRA as a murder gang started to disappear, with the RIC weekly summary actually referring to the IRA as the Irish Army on the morning of the truce. The reality was that the truce was a significant gain for Sinn Féin and the IRA. The terms agreed in July 1921 were in line with Sinn Féin demands in late 1920 and not the ones offered by the British at that juncture. The British effectively conferred belligerent status on the IRA as lawful combatants in a legitimate army. It was a formal public agreement between the IRA leadership and the British military command in Ireland. The IRA did not have to surrender its arms. There was an amnesty for senior IRA officers, and no execution of IRA members were carried out after the ceasefire began. Sinn Féin and the IRA recognised that the favourable terms of the truce were an embarrassment to the British government and were quick to publicly take advantage of it. The IRA newspaper on Tuglock said, "The guns are silent, but they remain in the hands of the Irish volunteers. From the military point of view, we remain exactly where we were. We have lost no advantage. From the points of view other than military, our position is stronger than ever before." There has been some controversy over activities committed by both sides, particularly by the IRA, between the announcement of the truce and its enactment at noon on Monday, 11th of July. It has been claimed by some historians that the IRA attacked so-called soft targets, spies and unarmed British forces, as last-minute killings to coincide with the truce, as there would be no retaliation once it was enacted. 7 suspected spies were killed by the IRA between the announcement and enactment of the truce. IRA units also killed roughly the same amount of unarmed Crown forces as they did active British units. The killing of 4 unarmed British soldiers in Ellis Quarry in Cork has come in for particular ire for its brutal nature. In total, the IRA was responsible for 25 fatalities between the announcement and enactment of the truce, whereas the British were responsible for 19 fatalities, almost the same number. 4 IRA volunteers were killed in combat with the British forces, while another 10 people, 7 civilians, 2 IRA volunteers, and 1 member of Cumann, Margaret Keogh, were killed by the British forces in the south of Ireland, who killed another 5 civilians during the disturbances in Belfast at the time. A total of 61 people died as a direct result of political violence in the days between the announcement and enactment of the truce. 22 of these occurred in Belfast in just over 1 day alone, Sunday 10th of July, which has become known as Belfast Bloody Sunday. Whilst the truce by and large held from noon on 11th of July in most of Ireland, it was barely adhered to in the north, as waves of sectarian violence engulfed Northern Ireland for the remainder of 1921 and on into 1922. The birth of Northern Ireland in the summer of 1921 had witnessed another wave of intense sectarian violence engulfing Belfast, resulting in the highest number of casualties since the shipyard expulsions of the previous summer. And here are 2 wounded RIC constables being carried to a lorry after being shot in Belfast. The timing of the truce, 11th of July, a day before the traditionally most testing day in Ulster, the 12th, further inflamed the sectarian violence. As a result of the truce, the Ulster Special Constabulary, an almost exclusively Protestant force, was demobilised, and the IRA was officially recognised, a move vehemently opposed by the Northern Ireland government. There were many specials to demobilise. According to Michael Farrell, by July 1921, there were over 20,000 A, B and C specials. IRA member Tom Fitzpatrick contended that the truce was not observed by either side in the north. Another IRA member, Roger McCauley, claimed in Belfast the truce itself lasted 6 hours only. The truce saw the IRA gain new respect from the Catholic community and many new recruits. With the demobilisation of the specials, loyalists joined the revived Ulster Volunteer Force and new vigilante groups such as the Imperial Guards and Cromwell clubs. They filled the void left by the specials until full responsibility of policing was handed over to the Northern Government in November 1921. The transfer of law and order responsibilities to the Northern Government on 22nd of November, the specials were able to remobilise again. The force at the disposal of the Northern authorities included about 2,500 RIC and over 24,000 specials that was being raised. It was unusual that the Northern Government, a regional one, was in possession of a paramilitary police force over which the central government had so little direct influence. And meanwhile, the IRA's numbers in the north had grown significantly in the latter half of 1921 after the truce. The Belfast Brigade of the IRA, which had only 367 members in June, grew to 632 by August. In the rest of County Antrim, the IRA's numbers swelled from 111 in June to 260 in August. By December, the IRA had trebled in size in 6 months to 835 in Belfast and 302 in Antrim. Throughout the whole 6 counties, the 3 IRA divisions had an active nominal strength of 2,157 before the truce. This had risen to well over 4,000 by October, still considerably below the loyalist numbers. The enlarged IRA and loyalist forces led to a renewed confrontation in late November. Bombs were thrown into trams carrying shipyard workers home in Corporation Street and Royal Avenue, killing 8 and wounding 9 others. With Catholics still expelled from the shipyards, clearly all the casualties were Protestants. The Loyalist reprisals resulted in 15 people killed on one day alone, 22nd of November. Late November resulted in 30 deaths, 16 Protestants and 14 Catholics, and 90 wounded, 59 Protestants and 31 Catholics. The bombing of the trams led to 2 cabinet conferences of the Northern government, where it was decided to conduct vigorous searches in the affected areas, to increase the amount of armoured and Lancia cars on the streets, and to utilise more A specials and soldiers. Strict curfews were maintained in Belfast, and pictured is a Castle Junction, Belfast city centre in the summer of 1921, empty instead of crowded, as it normally would be during daylight hours because of the curfew. Elsewhere in Ireland, some of the 61 killings that happened between the announcement and enactment of the truce did so as those responsible were unaware that the truce had been announced. Whilst most IRA units in Dublin were aware and stood down soon after the announcement of the truce, it took days for others to be informed that the truce had been agreed. And here are members of the auxiliaries fraternising with members of the public outside Dublin Castle shortly after the announcement of the truce. IRA General Headquarters, GHQ, drafted and printed hundreds of copies of the following dispatch. 2 officers commanding all units, in view of the conversations now being entered into by our government with the government of Great Britain, and in pursuance of mutual understandings to suspend hostilities during these conversations, active operations by our troops will be suspended as of from noon, Monday 11th of July. It was signed by the IRA Chief of Staff, Richard Mulcahy. Most IRA members were taken by surprise, having discarded the constant speculation and gossip of a pending truce for months previously. While some IRA units received official dispatches, others found out through the press. Ernie O'Malley, commander of the IRA 2nd Southern Division in Tipperary, was bewildered by the dispatch he received from GHQ. He nevertheless had orders typed and sent to the 5 IRA brigades under his command in Munster to observe the truce. Tom Barry found out through a newspaper that De Valera was meeting with Macready and only believed the rumours then. Some units in Clare and Galway only heard of the truce after 1 p.m. on Sunday, 10th of July, whilst others in North Wexford and Tyrone were unaware of the truce before late on Sunday night. The 4th Battalion of the IRA's Kilkenny Brigade only heard about it at 7 a.m. on 11th of July, and some never even heard about it before its enactment at noon that same day. One unit carried out an ambush in Macroom in Cork at 3 p.m. on 11th of July, forcing the surrender of auxiliaries and capturing their vehicle. Most British forces did not know about the truce until late on June 9th of July, with some not hearing about it until 10th of July. The truce came as a severe shock for many frontline Crown forces. General Edward Peter Strickland, commanding in Cork, complained that the flaunting of Sinn Féin flags everywhere is trying to temper of the police rather highly. It will be beyond human endurance for some people to lie down and be kicked by murderers. Many of the British felt they were on the cusp of quelling the rebellion. After a period of contention on the streets, troops and police were mostly pulled back into barracks to avoid confrontation, which seemed like a further defeat to many. After the truce, IRA training camps sprang up everywhere, some providing fieldcraft and ambush practice, as well as parade ground drilling. Drilling was allowed under the truce conditions, and here are some IRA members training and drilling close to Dublin after the truce. Mulcahy introduced a new ranking system into the IRA. It was doubted the war could be started again easily, as the shortage of arms and ammunition was severe. With access to British arms drying up, arms imports increased significantly. The arms and ammunition shortage were made to look worse though, due to the huge explosion in IRA numbers after the truce. The Irish Republican Army was in danger of becoming popular, said Ernie O'Malley. Recruits came in large numbers. Soon men appeared in uniform who had never shown much anxiety to run special risks when courage was needed. Many of the new recruits were mockingly dubbed Truceliers. Although hard to deduce real numbers, the paper strength of the IRA was 34,000 in July, 50,000 in October, 70,000 in December, and this had increased to 100,000 by the spring of 1922. It is hard to pinpoint the actual number of deaths caused by the Anglo-Irish War of Independence. Union O'Halpin and Dáithí Corran's study claims that from January 1917 to December 1921, there were 2,346 fatalities. there were big regional variations. For example, in Cork, there were 557 deaths, in Fermanagh, just 9. The vast majority were inflicted in Munster, particularly in Cork, and elsewhere deaths were concentrated in the cities of Belfast and Dublin. Of those killed, 491 were IRA, 523 were from different police forces, 413 from the British military, and 919 were civilians. There also were 4,500 IRA members interned and 2,000 convicted and imprisoned. The total casualties of the war were, in comparison with other conflicts that followed the First World War, fairly modest. In the frame of global conflicts, it hardly registers. David Leeson suggests the British and Irish let each other off lightly. Whilst the fatalities were comparatively low, the conflict still affected people in other ways, through hundreds of houses and businesses being burnt and thousands fleeing from their homes. While the violence ceased in most of Ireland, once the guns fell silent from noon on Monday 11th of July, many believed it would not last. It now came down to the negotiations between the British and Irish sides. Negotiations for a settlement began almost immediately afterwards, culminating 5 months later with the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. So thank you for your time. So I'm happy to take any questions and comments.
Thanks very much, Cormac. So far, we just had one question put in there by Neil asking who were the Imperial Guards.
So basically, they're a vigilante group in the north, so with kind of sectarian tensions rising, and a feeling among unionists that the IRA were spreading to Ulster, which they felt was happening in the beginning of 1920. You had a lot of kind of vigilante groups that sprung up. Basil Brooke, who became Prime Minister, he set up Fermanagh Vigilantes. There's a group in Armagh, and then you had Imperial Guards, and also I think the Imperial Guards, most of them were ex-soldiers from the First World War. But so a lot of people who were in the UVF, pre First World War, set up vigilante groups. Some of them went in with the specials, but once the specials were demobilised temporarily, a lot of them went into these kind of vigilante groups to continue on fighting against the IRA.
Okay, you have some praise there from Donald saying excellent, well done, Cormac. And then a question from Maria asking why were formal truce terms not produced back in July 100 years ago?
Well, I would say that's mainly down to the British. They didn't want formal truce July, so they could say certain things. They didn't want to use the term truce. They didn't want to use the term armistice. So they did use different terms, like this is an arrangement, a temporary kind of settlement, and they were using this kind of language, for a few months afterwards. Even though they actually recognised it as a form of truce, they recognised the IRA as the Irish Army, and they actually logged it with the League of Nations at the time. But I think for propaganda purposes, it suits them not to have it down in writing.
Okay, and something that I was curious about when you were talking about the violence which happened in the few days between the agreement getting sorted out at the Mansion House and then implemented, was there any danger that the truce might collapse, considering the violence that was breaking out in the few days leading up to noon on the Monday?
Well, I think we have to put it back into context of the time. Like if we look at, say, the end of the First World War, which only ended 3 years previously, less than 3 years previously, there was a huge amount of violence right up to 11 o'clock in the morning of the 11th of November. I think some Americans actually were actually firing their guns 30 seconds before 11 o'clock arrived. So it wasn't uncommon for a lot of activities to take place between the announcement and enactment of a truce. So there's no evidence that the truce was breaking down. Now, the British did use kind of their kind of term that the IRA were wantonly, going after soft targets, and the murdering campaign was continuing. But as I said, like there's about the IRA responsible for about 25 deaths, and the British were responsible for 19 deaths. So there are similar numbers between the announcement and enactment of the truce, and a lot of those are actually from people who were unaware that there was a truce happening. So now the British did actually ask their units to stand down. immediately as an official sanction, whereas the IRA never said anything about what to do before the announcement and enactment of the truce. GHQ didn't. Actually, only 3 IRA units in the whole country said go after Crown forces or spies in that period. The biggest being the first Eastern Division, but they actually didn't kill anyone. So, but it's a lot of us based on local decisions, whereas the GHQ didn't say anything specifically about what to do in that kind of time period. So to answer your question in terms of was it likely to break down? Not really, because it wasn't any abnormal activity if you compare it to other conflicts that happened at the same time in terms of between announcement and enactment of the truce.
Okay, and a couple of questions from Paul over in Connecticut. He's asked us, was there any disagreement between Eamon de Valera and, say, Michael Collins or others with regard to the conditions of the truce that might have indicated future disagreements over the treaty?
Yeah, a bit actually. Collins wanted a truce, and he wanted on the terms. The terms that were agreed in July were the terms that the IRA had asked for in December 1920, which eventually the British, you're talking about 1,000 deaths later, but the British agreed to those terms in July 1921 that had been asked for by the IRA in the late 1920, which Michael Collins is supportive of. He did say though at the time that by agreeing to a truce, that really does mean the Republic is dead, because you're agreeing to talk to the British, and the one thing the British always consistently stuck by was that there will be no Republic. And he was particularly critical of de Valera even agreeing to the treaty negotiations. The base of those treaty negotiations pretty much meant that there would be no Republic, and that was the concession as opposed to what happened in the subsequent negotiations from October to December. And that is something Michael Collins said about what Deb did in that intervening period was where kind of concessions happened as such. But there was broad agreement in the truce overall though at the time, and between all of the senior figures within the IRA and Sinn Féin. The problem was that some members of the IRA and Sinn Féin were idealists who really wanted a republic, and they felt that they were fighting for a republic, they were fighting for the 1916 dead, whereas others were open to Dominion Home Rule, including Collins and Griffith, and including de Valera. De Valera wasn't steadfast in republic. He was promoting his external association idea pretty much once his negotiations began with Lloyd George in July.
Okay, and Paul had just a follow-up question about is there any real objective data on how the general public in Ireland viewed the prospect of a truce in early 1921? Were the people tired of the War of Independence to a point where the IRA might start to lose support if the truce did not materialize?
Yeah, I don't know if there's much empirical data to be honest on that. Actually, as I mentioned in my talk, Hammer Greenwood, the Chief Secretary for Ireland, he said that in the early 1921 that the public were losing interest in the IRA. They weren't going to support him in the upcoming election in that May. But Hammer Greenwood was full of it, for want of a better term. He was known for his bluster and exaggerations. And actually, the official reprisal policy of the British, they felt that would actually backfire in the IRA, and actually would bring more people to be sick of the conflict, want to go back to normality, and it actually didn't work. It actually started to make in many ways heroes of the IRA fighting against the British Empire, and it was the British Empire or the British government were seen as instigators of most of the violence amongst the public. So although there definitely was great relief and great happiness when the truce happened amongst the public, there was a lot of support for the IRA, and I think the best judgment of that was the 1921 Southern Ireland election, where 124 out of 128 people were elected on the post for Sinn Féin. So there clearly was huge support for Sinn Féin and the IRA within the public.
Okay, and a question from Mikhail asking about how did both sides ensure peaceful conditions in Northern Ireland after the truce was signed?
Well, it didn't.
Yeah.
But they had liaison officers across the country. Like Tom Barry was a liaison officer. He actually was treated quite badly by the British military who wouldn't meet him because he was wearing a uniform. but he had Eoin O'Duffy in Ulster, and like there was attempts, but the problem with the conflict in Ulster is that it wasn't just a case of the British against the IRA. It was you had local people within the specials, basically a Protestant militia, a local Protestant militia that was fighting not just the IRA, but also Ancient Order Hibernians. And Ancient Order Hibernians were also weren't exactly very close with the IRA, both kind of trying to get the upper hand in representing the Catholic community. So there's a lot of different dynamics within the north than there was elsewhere in Ireland, and there was a real a nasty sectarian edge to the conflict in the north as well, where the vast majority of the people killed throughout that 2-year kind of waves of violence from the summer of 1920 to summer of 1922. The vast majority were civilians that were killed. So the truce didn't hold in the north.
Yeah. Okay, and then a question from Francie about the hold on, where is it there? About the terms of the truce. She's curious about, and in particular, which one was not acknowledged by the Irish?
Of the 5 terms and the 4 terms, I actually I don't know the exact one which wasn't acknowledged and which were, but it was that there was different interpretations, and even the wording, like to the IRA, it was clearly a truce between kind of 2 armies, legitimate armies, basically. Whereas the British would never say that publicly and kind of try to back down, even though the terms agreed, it was obvious that they were acknowledging that the IRA was a legitimate army, and they actually pretty much acknowledged that, as I said, with the talking to the League of Nations, in other words and actions and propaganda they used. They still were referring to the IRA as murderers and the murder gang.
Okay, and a question from Hugh about were the British press openly hostile to David Lloyd George entering negotiations with the IRA?
Well, it depends on which British press you talk about, because a lot of people in a lot of media outlets, liberal media outlets, were calling for truce for a long time, and were part of that campaign, which probably brought around a truce, in that the British public were sick of this conflict, and they could see what was happening as well. They could see the reprisals that were happening. They could see the burning of Cork. They could see actually the Custom House burning brought it to the kind of the homes of British public and international public as well. So this is a very visual. It was a very it was very well recorded, well documented conflict, and a lot of British media outlets were in favour of a truce and against British government policy. So some supported it. Others, like I think there seems to be a lot of support for a truce anyway within the British media outlets, but there were a lot of actually ones opposing British government policy before the truce.
Okay, and some questions from Councillor Neil Ring. He was asking about the truce, and he said he was surprised to see on television this morning when you were making an appearance that one of your colleagues said that the truce weakened the IRA, and then he also asked, did anyone sign anything, because yesterday in I presume the lunchtime session we were told that General Macready signed the truce.
Yeah, no, there's no documentary evidence of anything being signed, and that's something like maybe there has been, but it certainly is not being found yet. But as far as we know, nothing has been signed, and that's what the British wanted, that there be no kind of signed agreement. On the thing, did the truce weaken the IRA? In some ways, it did, in terms of they were out in the open. They actually couldn't get British arms anymore because they weren't fighting the British, and that's where they got a lot of their arms. But they got a lot more numbers. A lot more people joined the IRA, and also by agreeing to a truce, you are agreeing to negotiate. You're agreeing to actually reach a compromise. In that respect, the war had entered a new stage, and I'm not sure necessarily the truce, actually made the IRA weaker, but the IRA was weak in certain areas, particularly with ammunition and weapons. I emphasize ammunition because it's so little rounds of ammunition, which was extremely worrying for a lot of kind of different locations around the country at the time of the truce. I personally don't think it weakened the IRA. I think it actually, in many ways, legitimised them. And actually, if for example the truce broke down, the British kind of argument, their propaganda argument that the IRA was a murder gang and a bunch of assassins, crazed assassins, they couldn't use that anymore. The fact that they actually entered into a truce with the army showed that they were considered an army. So that kind of whole dimension of the British propaganda was pretty much gone after that. I think that strengthened the IRA. Personally, I don't think they were weakened by the truce, but it was complicated like everything else. So.
Okay, and some question from Donald about what we know about the personal relations between Eamon de Valera and Lloyd George, and Eamon de Valera and James Craig.
Lloyd George famously said, talking to de Valera was like picking up mercury with a fork. So they didn't have a very good relationship. They're very different type of characters. And actually, Craig, who had a very kind of, wouldn't say a pointless meeting, but had a meeting with de Valera in May the 5th on Holt Road in 1921. They didn't agree on anything at all, and their kind of viewpoints of what a solution to the North to partition were incompatible. But actually, Craig did give advice to de Valera at the time. He said, when you're do not go alone with Lloyd George. He's a very slippery character, and he'll say one thing and do the other. So just be on your guard with Lloyd George, which was actually very sound advice on the part of Craig to de Valera. But they didn't get on well. Lloyd George found de Valera extremely frustrating. He couldn't get through to him at all, and de Valera was very insistent on sticking to his laid out plans. And de Valera, like, one of the arguments used against de Valera for not going to London for the treaty negotiations from October is that he should have gone. He knew what Lloyd George was like. He knew what it was like negotiating with him, and he would have actually been the strongest card they have by going there and how to deal with Lloyd George. But yeah, they definitely didn't have a close relationship. They didn't see eye to eye. They were like Lloyd George and de Valera were very different personalities, extremely different personalities. Whereas Craig and de Valera only met once, so they corresponded quite a bit, but they didn't see eye to eye much either.
Okay, and just a clarification there about Niall Ring's question. It was about the burning of the Custom House, weakening the IRA, the claim that was made this morning. And I know that's something that's been discussed a lot lately.
Yeah, Pádraig Ó Gearróch actually mentioned that. I personally don't agree with that because, yes, obviously a lot of people were captured after the Custom House, and a lot of weapons were captured, but it was actually a big morale booster for the IRA in Dublin, and they got a lot of new recruits afterwards. And they still, most IRA members from Dublin were not actually captured, so they still were quite strong numerically, even though weapons was a big problem after the Custom House. And they actually had over 100 ambushes in June alone, which shows that they were still extremely active after the Custom House burning. And it was considered a big PR coup. It was all over the international press, and it achieved what it wanted to do, was to strike at the heart of the British administration of Dublin. So, I don't agree necessarily with that point that argument this morning.
Okay, I'll ask you just one more question, perhaps here from Mark. Is it fair to assume that there never was any belief in achieving a 32-county republic? Is this why Michael Collins refused to submit proposals to the British on the 4th of December, later to become known as Document 2?
When Michael Collins, Document 2 were de
Valera's Document 2. But I suppose just a question then about the belief that there was never any belief in achieving a 32-county republic during this time.
Yeah, I think like the Sinn Féin position, or de Valera's specific position, was, when he started negotiation with Lloyd George, was a republic for the 26 counties, or Dominion rule for 32 counties. So I don't think it was ever really achievable. They believed 32-county republic at that juncture. But the idea of some form of United Ireland was still on the table, even though it was unrealistic. Unrealistic is a very strong word. It was unlikely. But Lloyd George tried to squeeze Craig a number of occasions from the summer of 1921, when Northern Ireland was established, to before the treaty was signed, to get Northern Ireland, maintain Northern Ireland as a parliament, but under Dublin Parliament, subservient to Dublin Parliament instead of Westminster. The British are actually trying that as well. So Ulster was a huge part of the negotiations of Sinn Féin throughout the treaty negotiations, and they eventually blundered greatly by agreeing to boundary commission, not necessarily by agreeing to a boundary commission, but by its very vague and ambiguous terms, which subsequently meant that Northern Ireland remained the status that it still has today. So yeah, but the Republic never was really seen as a realistic prospect by the negotiators. And actually, a good point made by John Dorney this morning on Morning Ireland was that I think the problem with Sinn Féin leadership at the time that could have averted the civil war was they probably should have let their own people know, what was possible, what was achievable, and what was on the cards, and it might have helped prevent a subsequent civil war. If people on the ground, whether it was IRA units in Munster or kind of the more Republican leaders of Sinn Féin, that let's be realistic here. What can we achieve here? And if that was actually the internal work was done more rigorously on what was achievable, it might have averted civil war. But a republic was always unlikely from July 1921. It was always unlikely. The British, that was something they were not going to agree to no matter what, really.
Okay. Right. Well, I see we've gotten to 2 o'clock, so I suppose we'll start wrapping up. Just want to thank Cormac for his talk here this afternoon, and thank everybody for joining on our lunchtime session. I will just mention that tomorrow afternoon, again at 1 o'clock, we have another talk dealing with the truce. We're going to have Dr. Mary Muldowney talking about how the truce was covered in the Irish and the international press at the time. That will wrap up this week's selection of talks. And I'll just also mention here in the chat box there, I've just done a short little 6-minute video about the truce plaque that's outside the Mansion House for anybody that wants to learn about the actual plaque itself, which was installed 50 years ago. But again, thanks very much for your time, and hopefully I'll see you all back here tomorrow afternoon. I'll be hosting again, and I'm looking forward to Mary's talk about the press and the truce. So thanks very much, Cormac, and thanks very much to everybody for your attendance this afternoon.
Thanks, James. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.